I said at the start of the previous lecture that the only thing that made city life possible in cities today, as well as in ancient Rome, was infrastructure. But sometimes, well, things fall apart. In this lecture, we're going to look at Rome under the Emperor Hadrian from the experience of a less fortunate individual than our friend Hermes, who we looked at previously. Here, we're going to follow a very poor non-Roman, Malchio. And once again, as with Hermes, this was a real person. It's something of a composite, but we do know of a man named Malchio who came to Rome, and so this is a little bit of a homage to him. So our Malchio came to Rome as a glassblower, and we'll see him as he makes his way through a day in Rome with the simple goal of surviving until the night. You see, his job as a glassblower relies on raw materials imported from the Eastern Mediterranean, which determine the level of demand for his labor. No raw materials, no job. So he is all the time one shipwreck away from losing his job. Malchio's first enemy, however, isn't unemployment, but xenophobia. As the Roman poet Juvenal, a brilliant observer of life in Rome at this time, relates, some in Rome held very strong attitudes against foreigners, particularly those, like Malchio, from the exotic and distant East. He captures this attitude in Satire 3, a quote, a translation of Juvenal. For the Syrian Orontes has long since polluted the Tiber, bringing its language and customs, pipes and harp strings, end quote. Juvenal's attack on immigration from the Far East, that is the Eastern Mediterranean, what today would be Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, is metaphorical, as he refers to the Orontes River as the stream of immigrants. The Orontes is one of the major rivers of the Eastern Mediterranean, as it passes through, in modern terms, Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. Well, Juvenal's account makes it clear that it's not a new phenomenon, but still unwelcome in the cultural changes that immigration brings to Rome, foreign languages and customs, and music. The reference to music is actually not to popular music, but to the music played during rituals of the cults that came from the East. Such attitudes surely did not make non-Romans such as Malchio feel welcome in Roman society. Well, rather than a brick-faced concrete insula in the nice part of town like our friend Hermes, Malchio lives in what we would refer to today as a tenement. That is, a dark, overcrowded, dank, dirty, possibly dangerous building on the edge of collapse. Now, yes, I had said previously, and thanks for paying attention, that there were building codes in Rome, thanks to the Emperor Nero, but there's no body tasked with enforcing them. And you'll be shocked to learn not everyone obeys the law, especially when there's no enforcement and there's money to be made in ignoring it. Many of the poor, therefore, the very poorest in Rome, live in wretched conditions, generally at the top floors of these tenements. You see, rents drop with the number of stairs one has to climb. The higher you are up, the more precarious the construction and the cheaper the apartment. But, why listen to me? We can hear about this from Juvenal, whose satires, which I quoted in the previous lecture, we get a sense of what these places were like. Juvenal says, "It's hard to climb the ladder when constricted private resources block your talents. But at Rome, the effort is greater still. They're expensive, wretched lodgings." Juvenal here nicely compares climbing the social ladder with the physical climb to the top floor of a tenement. Now, living on the top floor of a tenement had its own special problems besides walking up 6 flights of stairs each time. Well, again, Juvenal makes it clear in Satire 3. Who fears, or ever feared, that their house might collapse in cool Praeneste or in Volsini among the wooded hills? These are both towns in the countryside outside of Rome. We inhabit a Rome held up for the most part by slender props, since that's the way management stopped the buildings falling down. Once they've covered some ancient yawning crack, they'll tell us to sleep soundly on the edge of ruin. Then there's the issue of fire, a serious problem in a tall wooden building. Fire spread upward, as Juvenal describes in this passage involving a character named Ucaligon. A non-Roman name you may have guessed already. Ucaligon is already summoning a hose, moving his things, and your third floor is already smoking. You're unaware, since if the alarm was raised downstairs, the last to burn will be the one a bare tile protects from the rain, up there where gentle doves coo over their eggs. So what he's saying here is that the upper floor residents are trapped by a fire below and by the lack of alarms to tell them to evacuate early. If a fire breaks out on any floor down below, it's going to move up as heat rises and trap the residents on the very upper floors. That is, if Malchio is one of the fortunate ones who has even a single room under the rafters. The homeless population in ancient Rome was certainly huge, and many of those people slept on the sidewalks, under porticos, in sanctuaries, or in insula on the stairs, in halls, or even in the latrines wedged under the staircases on the ground floors of most of these high-rises. Wherever they could get off the street, really. Without a social safety net, many of these people would die of exposure or exhaustion, or of one of the 1,000 small illnesses that, if left untreated, could kill them. Some apparently slept in the bath complexes. That is, if they could afford the modest admission charge to begin with. Many could not. We don't know exactly what these were like in terms of whether people could stay the night or how long they were allowed in or whether they cleaned out people every day. So the number of people, the homeless, sleeping in the baths is a bit of a problem, but we're certain that they are in fact there. The baths, as touched on in the previous lecture, were good for another informal type of aid, that is, dinner invitations. Juvenal again gives the reality and the costs of begging for dinner scraps. In his Satire 5, he says, "If you lack whatever it takes to fill your empty stomach, is there no beggar's pitch vacant? No archway or lesser half of a mat somewhere? Are insults for dinner worth it? Are you as famished as that? Wouldn't it be more honest to shiver outside and gnaw bread left behind by the dogs?" Juvenal clearly finds the humiliation of begging for dinner and the inevitable insults less attractive than begging on the street. He might be exaggerating here. This could all be hyperbole, but in general we actually think that he is reflecting actual attitudes in Rome at the time. Be that as it may, either form of begging seems to have been common, whether it's on the street or just begging for a dinner invitation. Well, what about the alimenta that we discussed in the last lecture? The grain disbursements, the wheat that comes out once a month to Roman citizens. Well, those are only for citizens. And even for them, the grain wasn't enough to live on, just to supplement the diet of those citizens. You also need to think about storage. Without adequate storage facilities, grain can rot or be eaten or spoiled by vermin. If you live in one of these tenement apartments, there's no place to store grain and nothing to do with it. You have to grind it, make bread. There's no place to bake it. It really is, in fact, a difficult problem. The poorer you are, the less you have of any of these things that make life possible. And that brings us to the big 5 unavoidable dangers of urban life: flood, fire, famine, plague, and earthquake. I'm going to assign some probabilities to these great dangers. The cumulative effect of any of these, or of all of them, is that the longer Malchio lives in Rome, the more certain he is to experience one of these catastrophic dangers. According to my calculations, based on the phenomenal work of Greg Aldretti, who teaches his own courses for the Great Courses, a Roman living in the floodplain or the low areas of the city, that is, off of the 7 hills, had a 5% annual chance of experiencing a major flood. This isn't a problem for those on the hills, but the hills are largely high-rent districts. The poor are disproportionately found in the low areas of the city. So, by virtue of their poverty, their chance of experiencing a flood increases. Floods of the Tiber could be powerful, sweeping away wooden buildings, and could take time to recede, leaving residents homeless or trapped in public areas seeking refuge on the high ground, unable to return to their homes for sometimes several days. And the nature of Rome's sewers makes things worse. The sewers in Rome are combined storm and sanitary sewers, which means that they carry both water from the baths and fountains and latrines, as well as any overflow from storms. This means that when floods carry the waters across the city and the sewers overflow, they're contaminated with sewage, not just river water. So, floods generally leave behind them at least small famines, as the food supply is contaminated by water, mud, or debris, and they also leave behind them minor plagues, as the water supply is tainted by these contaminated floodwaters. In a world lit only by fire, the threat of uncontrollable fire sweeping through a room, a building, or an entire neighborhood was very real. If you read 19th century newspapers, you'll see that not much has changed even by then. Fires in most cities, in every city that I know of, were a daily occurrence because of cooking fires, lamps, coal or oil heat, etc. Lots of burning went on to keep people warm, dry, and fed, and to provide light. And that doesn't even consider industrial uses, such as glass blowing, which Malchio would participate in, which are found throughout the city. There is no industrial zone outside. We have industries that use open flame scattered throughout the city. And so, there's always that danger of fire breaking out at any time. Once again, the poor live upstairs, and since fire rises, the upper floors of houses and apartments are usually much more heavily damaged. By my calculations, there was at least a 6% annual chance for a major fire that would affect Malchio while he lived in Rome. The good news is that widespread famine, plague, and earthquakes are much rarer than fire and flood, but they're not completely unknown. The Emperor Trajan himself, the emperor who was on the throne immediately before Hadrian, the Emperor Trajan almost died in a collapsed building caused by an earthquake. So these affect pretty much everybody. However, if we total up the probabilities for these three catastrophic disasters as well, someone in the floodplain in Rome had a 23% chance of being affected by one of the 5 major disasters each year, while someone living on one of the hills had a 16% chance per year. These are the facts of life in this ancient city. Now, I should say that those are the probabilities that one will be affected by fire, flood, famine, earthquake, or so on. That's not to say that you would be killed by them, just that those would affect your living space. There are more fun facts of life in ancient Rome when you look at the map of water distribution in the city. In some quarters in AD 120 under Hadrian, when we're looking now, there wasn't much running water at all. And so people would have to make long walks to the baths or public fountains for household water. And of course, carrying water upstairs was a daily chore. I mentioned in a previous lecture that in graduate school, I lived for a while in a small town in Greece, and that part of my duties included carrying buckets of water from the public fountain to my professor's house for all her household uses. Thinking about it, a 3-gallon bucket is about 25 pounds of water. Put one in each hand for balance and to reduce the number of trips, and you get a good workout by the 3rd floor of a building. If you try climbing to the 6th floor, you're carrying on each load 50 pounds up 6 flights of stairs for every load. And it takes a lot of water, actually, to run a household. Well, speaking of work, what about jobs? all that imperial building under Trajan and Hadrian requires work. That's true. And these were, in fact, jobs programs. We know that, that these were not, by and large, work of slaves. But most of that work is skilled work. And skilled workers own and bring their own tools. And we know this actually from their tombstones. A lot of skilled workers actually define their identity by putting their tools, the set of the tools of their trade, on their gravestone, so you knew what their status was in life. The truly poor, like Malchio, don't qualify for these jobs because they're not skilled laborers and they don't have their own tools. There is day labor, but most of the very low-rung jobs, such as cleaning streets and bath complexes, hauling building material, and so forth, was done by slaves. Sometimes private slaves, but often by the public slaves, who were owned by each city. Slave labor probably also depressed workers' wages in the same way that today people there's this debate, but I think it's clear, unpaid internships reduce entry-level positions today, the number of positions and the pay. That's not to equate unpaid internships with slave labor exactly, but the mechanism is the same. That is, free labor depresses starting salaries. So how does Malchio fill his time if he isn't in the baths fetching towels in the hopes of catching a dinner invitation? There's a lot of sitting around in public places. The number of game boards scratched or cut into the stone steps, piazzas, and pavements of public buildings all around the city of Rome is truly amazing. There must have been many people sitting around for much of the day with time on their hands, just like Malchio. And so what you see as you walk around, well, not just Rome, but other Roman cities, are these game boards that are actually carved or etched into public areas. And we think that these were, if you consider, I think I could compare them to chessboards in public parks. People would hang out all day and pick up games. We have that here in Rome. And we think that people are just doing this on a regular basis. So in addition to the baths and the forum, the baths where you're hanging around waiting for a meal, or the forum where you're just playing games, very often the wealthy would open the gardens on their vast private estates on the edges of the city to fellow Romans. Here, in these gardens, a poor Roman might have a chance of running into wealthier citizens. Unfortunately, there were always other Roman citizens above him in class who stood a better chance of seizing every precious opportunity for beneficence or patronage. And even they faced competition. Juvenal again describes the scene for us in stark terms in Satire 3. Then, not to flatter ourselves, what office or service is left for a poor man here, even if he dons his toga and dashes about in the dark? Here, a free-born son is detailed to escort a rich man's slave. That reference to dashing about in the dark describes the salutatio. This is the early morning greeting ritual that was required of poor men who were clients of wealthy Roman patrons. They had to show up at dawn at their patron's house, so rushing around in the dark, as Juvenal mentions, to greet the patron formally upon his rising. And then there would be a small audience where the patron would give gifts, and then it was required of all of these clients to accompany their patron as he went about his morning duties, particularly to escort him in this procession down to the forum. But Juvenal also scorns the rise of the wealthy but lower class men above citizens of higher rank but less wealth. Nowadays, he says, a rich man's slave is attended by free-born men. He's offended by this turn of events. And this actually is not hyperbole. This is an actual turn of events at the time. We have lists that have been compiled by modern scholars of fortunes under the emperors. And setting aside the wealth of the emperors themselves, the wealthiest men we know of from ancient Rome at this period were actually former slaves. former slaves could accumulate massive wealth, which means that they would be above, in many social terms, the very poor but citizen Romans. And down at the very bottom of all of this are the poor non-Romans. Well, nighttime could be particularly dangerous for someone on their own on the streets of Rome. Heck, it still is today. I've been mugged myself on the streets of Rome a couple of times. It's always kind of exciting. But to get a sense of how dark Rome was in antiquity as opposed to today, think about this. There's no artificial light. To really get a sense of this, I think you can look at a satellite image of East Asia sometime. One of the satellite images at night. You can spot North Korea pretty readily. It's as black as the inside of a sack. There's no light at all, compared particularly to South Korea, just adjacent to it. Rome could be like that. Those members of the urban cohorts in the Watch that I mentioned in the previous lecture might be around, but they might not be. And if Malchio is attacked on the street, there's no investigative force to hunt down or charge the perpetrator. The Watch only intervenes when they're present. They're there to watch. And the urban cohorts, similarly. They patrol, but you can't go and report anything to them. Prosecution of a crime is a private matter and had to be paid for by the victim. You had to either argue your case in court yourself or hire an attorney. And so somebody who's very poor, who's attacked on the street, really has no legal recourse, no practical legal recourse. They themselves, by virtue of their poverty again, are somewhat trapped into this victim status. So what alternatives were there? Well, if Malchio can't get a job or becomes unemployed as a glassblower because, the shipwreck and the raw materials don't come from the East, if he's still young enough, he might consider a couple of possible alternatives. He might join the military or become a gladiator. Either option is limited to a subset of the male population, but it had real benefits: food, shelter, pay, medical care, and discharge benefits, assuming, of course, he survives his enlistment period. My own work on the demographics of life in ancient Rome, demographics meaning lifespan or life expectancy, shows that enlistments in the army were generally limited to young men, 18 to 22 years old. The Navy, on the other hand, saw enlistments of men into their 40s. It seems to have been a fallback or a second career for some men who had problems of whatever type in their early career. And while enlistment in the Army required 20 years of service for full benefits, for the Navy it required 25. And again, based on my own calculations, men in the Army, Navy, or gladiatorial ranks tended to live an average of 5 years less than civilians. Actually signing up to be a gladiator might be a good bet for some young men. Think about it for just a minute. You're in Rome, and looming above, quite literally, almost every other public structure in Rome is the Colosseum, this massive venue for spectacular entertainment. You have this 4-story building, and they're high stories. It's really about 110 feet tall, clad on the outside with gleaming white stone, and perhaps 160 sculptures on the outside, great sculptures of emperors in chariots, and you go in. There's seating for 50,000 people, all seated there under awnings, and they're all there to see a number of activities, but the main event is gladiatorial combat. And those gladiators in that venue could really be the focus of tremendous amounts of positive support and attention. I think the equivalent today would be an NFL player, professional football player in one of our great modern stadiums. You get that sense of their celebrity status. They are famous. They can become wealthy, and it's really attractive. My research on gladiators shows that under the Emperor Hadrian in 120, they were treated as professionals. They were trained and cared for. They had generally short careers, perhaps only a few years. They fought at most several times a year, and they were expected to survive their bouts. That is, they're not all expected to die. If they survived, gladiators could become wealthy and famous. They could become actually empire-wide celebrities. We know that gladiators, for example, would go on these tours where at the stadiums, at the Colosseum and other amphitheaters, they would sell souvenirs with the gladiator's name on them. And so these guys would become worldwide celebrities. And they might be freed from being a gladiator after only 10 years or so. Compare that to the 20 years in the Army or 25 in the Navy. Of course, their mortality rate was almost 50%. That is, 50% died before the average life expectancy. For the Army, the mortality rate at this period was only 2.8% for battle. That is, 2.8% of the enlisted men in the Army at this period died in battle. Many more of them probably died of disease and other things. But the chance of surviving to retirement after a 20-year enlistment was also right around 50%. For the Navy, the chance of retiring, that is surviving to a 25-year term, is about 45%. Juvenal, again, describes the choice facing a young man named Rutilius. The final line of his poem, I think, is very poignant. It's clear that many young men were desperate. Perhaps Malchio will be as well. We read about this in Satire 11. Every dinner party, every bathhouse, square, and theater is talking of Rutilius. While his limbs are young, they say, and strong enough for him to fight in a helmet, while his blood still burns hotly, he's about to sign up for the code of the gladiatorial school, with its royal decrees free from the tribune's pressure or veto. You can find plenty like him. Poor women didn't even have those limited options. For them, there were really three major options: employment, marriage, or prostitution. And the latter two of these, marriage and prostitution, only if they were young, and marriage generally only if they had some money for a dowry. So really that eliminates most of the very poor, women who were orphaned, and so on. Employment had its own problems. Bars and taverns provided one of the largest categories of jobs for poor women, that is, non-Roman women in the city. But those employees had virtually no legal protections. For example, just like prostitutes, there was no law against raping barmaids. That is, barmaids and prostitutes could make no claim of rape in the courts. So the city of Rome, as experienced by Malchio, could be a very dangerous place. For the extremely poor, who made up much of the city's population, housing was expensive and substandard. The social safety net available to Roman citizens did not include them. And the amenities of the city were not diversions to make their lives more fulfilling, although they did provide spaces and opportunities that might just make their lives possible as they engaged with wealthier Romans who could be benefactors. It's true that the emperor was the great patron of the city, but his influence was limited, and in the lives of the lower class, foreign, even skilled laborers, it might not have appeared at all. The problem of huge numbers of poor, homeless, and destitute might seem almost inevitable in a Roman city or in an ancient city such as Rome. And of course, these problems still plague life in many cities today. But in fact, they weren't found in all ancient cities. In our next lecture, we'll visit a city close to Rome, Ostia, which seems to have none of these troubles.